Even if Jacob Thornton married every woman in Montana, he'd still leave you for last. The laughter that followed cut through the entire festival grounds. Every head turned. Every eye landed on Abigail Moore, standing alone at her modest booth, holding a jar of preserved peaches, saying absolutely nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She simply set the jar down and kept working. And then Jacob Thornton, the wealthiest rancher in the territory. The man every beautiful woman in Silver Creek had been competing for all morning, walked straight past all of them and stopped only at her. If you've ever been underestimated by everyone around you, subscribe to our channel, follow this story to the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The laughter started before Abigail Moore even reached her booth. She heard it, the way she always heard things clearly, completely, without the mercy of distance, softening the edges. 3 men standing near the water barrel at the edge of the Summer Harvest Festival grounds. Their voices carrying across the warm Montana morning like they owned the air itself. One of them was Randall Dutton, the youngest son of the Dutton cattle family, 22 years old and already as arrogant as a man twice his age. He was pointing. Not subtly. Not with any awareness that pointing at a person the way you'd point at a broken fence post was something a decent human being simply didn't do. I was pointing directly at Abigail. "Lord Almighty," Randall said loud enough for at least a dozen people nearby to hear. "Every summer my mama tells me the Harvest Festival is when Silver Creek shows its best face." He paused, letting his 2 companions absorb the setup. "Somebody forgot to tell the Moore girl." The laughter that followed wasn't polite. It wasn't the uncomfortable kind that people quickly swallow when they realize they've crossed a line. It was the full, easy laughter of men who had never once in their lives been on the receiving end of a crowd's cruelty, and who therefore had no understanding of what that sound did to a person. Abigail kept walking. She had her father's old wooden crate balanced in both arms, filled with jars of preserved peaches and dried corn, and the hand-stitched sachets her mother made during the long Montana winters, when her hands were well enough to work. The crate was heavier than it looked. Abigail had carried it 4 blocks from the store alone because there was no one to help her carry it. There hadn't been anyone to help her with anything for the better part of 3 years. Not since her father's heart gave out and left her with a store, a sick mother, a stack of debts, and a town that had somehow concluded that a woman who worked hard and kept quiet and didn't spend money, she didn't have on dresses she didn't need, was a woman to be pitied or laughed at. She set the crate down at her booth, a modest table at the far eastern edge of the festival grounds, which was where the festival organizers always put the Moore booth, because the Moore booth didn't generate the kind of excitement that warranted prime placement near the center square. She began arranging her jars with the same methodical precision she applied to everything peaches in the front row corn behind them. Sachets to the right, where the morning light caught the stitching and made it look briefly beautiful. Randall Dutton wasn't finished. He had followed her. Not because he had any particular interest in Abigail Moore, but because the laughter had felt good, and he wanted more of it, and she was still there, still available as material. "You know what I heard," he said to his companions, though his eyes were on Abigail. "I heard old Jacob Thornton is finally thinking about choosing a wife. Mama says half the ranching families in the territory are sending their daughters today. Helena Marsh is wearing that blue silk dress you see it worth more than most men earn in a season." He leaned against the edge of Abigail's table without asking permission close enough that she could smell the whiskey already on his breath at 9 in the morning. "I figured Jacob could marry every woman in Montana territory, line them up one by one, and Abigail Moore would still be last." One of his friends made a sound that was half laugh, half wince. Abigail finished arranging her sachets. She did not look up. She said very quietly and very clearly, "Randall, your father's south fence line has been damaged for 6 weeks. 3 sections down near the creek tributary. You're losing cattle through it. I know because I've been watching the count discrepancy in your family's feed purchases." She finally looked up and met his eyes without flinching. "You might want to go home and fix that instead of standing here telling jokes." Randall's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I don't know what you're—" "I keep the accounts for 9 families in this valley," Abigail said, her voice carrying the same unhurried certainty it always did. I see the numbers. The numbers don't lie even when people do. She looked back down at her table. Enjoy the festival. He left. He didn't storm off or make a scene about it. He simply left his companions following slightly behind him, the laughter gone. One of them glanced back at Abigail with an expression that wasn't quite apology, but wasn't nothing either. She didn't acknowledge it. 3 hours later, Jacob Thornton arrived. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone in Silver Creek knew who Jacob Thornton was. You couldn't live in this valley for 26 years and not know the man who owned Carter Creek Ranch, 1,800 acres of prime Montana rangeland, the largest herd in the territory. A house that had been built by his grandfather and expanded by his father and maintained by Jacob himself with a quiet, steady pride that never tipped into boasting. I was 36 years old. He had dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, and he was the kind of tall that made other men instinctively stand up straighter when he walked into a room. He had been engaged once, 7 years ago, to a woman named Clara Whitfield, and Clara had died of fever the spring before their wedding, and Jacob Thornton had not been seriously courted by any woman since, which was a fact that drove the mothers of Silver Creek to the absolute edge of distraction. He arrived at the Harvest Festival the way he arrived everywhere alone, unhurried, dressed well, but not showily. He did not appear to be looking for anything in particular. But Abigail, who had spent her entire life developing the ability to observe people without appearing to observe them, noticed immediately that his eyes moved differently than other men's eyes at social gatherings. Most men at a festival like this looked for things that pleased them. Jacob Thornton looked for things that were true. He spent 20 minutes walking the festival grounds. He stopped at the Marsh booth. Longest Helena Marsh was there in her blue silk dress, exactly as Randall had described, and she was genuinely beautiful, genuinely charming, laughing at exactly the right moments, and touching Jacob's arm with precisely calculated casualness. Her father, William Marsh, stood slightly behind her with the satisfied expression of a man watching an investment perform. Jacob was polite to Helena. He was gracious. He bought a small jar of her family's honey. And then he moved on. He stopped at 4 other booths. He bought a small something at each one. He spoke to people he knew, listened more than he talked, and gradually with the patient deliberateness of a man who had somewhere specific to be worked his way toward the eastern edge of the festival grounds. Toward Abigail's booth. She saw him coming when he was still 30 feet away and told herself it meant nothing. He was being thorough. He was visiting every booth. She turned to adjust her jars, which didn't need adjusting, and forced herself to breathe at a normal rate. He stopped in front of her table. "Miss Moore," he said. She looked up. "Mr. Thornton." He looked at her booth, at the carefully arranged jars, the quality of the preserved fruit visible through the glass, the hand-stitched sachets, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Not into admiration exactly, but into a kind of attentiveness that Abigail wasn't accustomed to seeing directed at her. "You keep accounts," he said, "for families in the valley." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "I do. My father used the same accountant for 20 years, Jacob said. Old Tom Pierce. Tom retired last spring and his son took over." He paused. "His son is not Tom." Abigail waited. "I've been going over 6 months of ledgers," Jacob continued, "and I can see that numbers are moving that shouldn't be moving. Money leaving accounts I don't recognize. Feed purchases that don't match the herd counts." His voice was even, but his jaw was tight. "I've shown them to 2 men in this town, and they've both told me the books look fine." "They don't look fine," Abigail said. Jacob looked at her directly for the first time. "You've seen them." "No. But Tom Pierce's system was very specific. He cross-referenced feed costs against seasonal herd weight gain. If someone unfamiliar with his system took over and started adjusting numbers, the imbalances would show up in a particular pattern." She hesitated, then added, "The pattern you're describing." The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Miss Moore," Jacob said, "would you help me solve a problem no one else could?" The question fell into the festival morning like a stone dropped into still water. Abigail was aware in the peripheral way. She was always aware of everything that people nearby had gone quiet. That Helena Marsh, standing 40 feet away, still holding her jar of honey, had turned to look. That Randall Dutton, somewhere behind her, had stopped moving. She looked at Jacob Thornton and understood with the clarity of a woman who had spent her entire adult life having to be smarter and more careful than everyone around her simply to survive, that this moment would define something. She didn't yet know what. "Tell me what you found," she said, "and I'll tell you if I can help." He came to the store the next morning at 7 o'clock, before she had the door properly unlocked. He brought a leather satchel with 6 months of ledgers inside it, and he set them on the counter without ceremony or preamble, which she appreciated. Men who were accustomed to being deferred to often spent a great deal of time at the beginning of any interaction establishing their importance. Jacob Thornton apparently felt no such need. "I need to know if I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing," he said, "or if I'm a fool who's angry at arithmetic." Abigail pulled the first ledger from the satchel and opened it. She started reading. Jacob Thornton leaned against the wall across from her and waited. She noticed the particular stillness of a man who had spent years working in open country. The kind of stillness that didn't come from laziness, but from an understanding that patience and movement were both tools, and that a man who couldn't be patient when patience was required was a man who would eventually lose things he couldn't afford to lose. She read for 40 minutes without speaking. He waited for 40 minutes without speaking. When she finally looked up, she turned to page 14 of the second ledger and set it on the counter in front of him, pointing to a specific line. "This feed purchase," she said. "On March the 4th, 1,200 pounds of winter hay, charged at a premium rate." "I remember approving it," Jacob said. "We had a hard freeze." "You did, but look at March 22nd. She turned to page 17. "Another purchase, 800 pounds, same premium rate." The freeze was still on. "Yes, but look at the stable records." She reached into the satchel and pulled out a separate ledger, the ranch's operational log, which he had included almost as an afterthought. "March the 15th. You moved 60 head of cattle to the Billings stockyard for pre-sale inspection. Those cattle were gone for 3 weeks. She looked at him. "You were paying premium winter rates to feed cattle that weren't there." Jacob Thornton's expression didn't change dramatically. There was no dramatic realization. There was instead a very quiet, very controlled tightening around his eyes that told Abigail this man was going to be absolutely dangerous to whoever had done this to him. "Keep going," he said. She kept going. By noon she had found 11 separate discrepancies. By 2 in the afternoon she had found 19. By the time the light through the store window turned the amber color that meant it was nearly 4 o'clock, she had mapped a pattern that was not random, not accidental, and not the work of someone who had made mistakes. It was the work of someone who knew Tom Pierce's system well enough to exploit the gaps in it, who had access to both the financial ledgers and the operational records, and who had been doing this for. She went back through the dates twice to be sure, not 6 months, 3 years. "Mr. Thornton," Abigail said carefully, "this has been going on since before Tom Pierce retired." The silence in the store was absolute. "How much," Jacob said finally, "are we talking about?" "I need the annual ledgers, the full records." She met his eyes. "But based on what you've brought me today, conservatively, $4,000. Jacob Thornton pushed himself off the wall, walked to the window, and stood there for a long moment, looking at nothing. I know," Abigail said. "That's my South grazing lease renewal." "I know." "If I can't renew that lease." "I know," she said for the third time more gently. "Whoever is doing this knew that too." He turned from the window and looked at her across the counter, and in his expression was something that she had almost never seen directed at her by anyone. Not pity, not condescension, not the particular blank politeness that people deployed when they wanted to be kind without being interested. It was recognition. The look of a man who had found something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. "I need to know who," he said. "So do I," she said. It was in that moment, not the moment at the festival, not later in the official contract signing, but this specific quiet moment with the afternoon light fading and 19 proven discrepancies laid out on her counter, that Abigail Moore understood something had shifted. She couldn't have named it precisely. She wasn't the kind of woman who named things before she was sure of them. But it was there. The contract was signed 3 days later. 6 months. Access to all of Carter Creek Ranch's financial records going back 5 years. A workspace in the ranch office. Compensation that was by any honest measure twice what she could earn from her accounts in town in the same period. The moment word got out, and in Silver Creek word always got out, the reaction was immediate and completely predictable. The first person to say something directly to Abigail's face was Edna Marsh, Helena's mother, who appeared in the general store the morning after the contract was known and stood at the counter with the expression of a woman who had prepared her remarks carefully. "I hope you understand," Edna Marsh said with a warmth so constructed that it had visible seams, "that Jacob Thornton is a private man who sometimes makes decisions out of kindness, dear. He's a good man, a generous man. People shouldn't misinterpret generosity." Abigail finished wrapping a package of dried beans for the customer she'd been helping, handed it over with a smile, and then looked at Edna. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "I've been hired to audit 5 years of financial records at Carter Creek Ranch. It's an accounting job. Would you like to buy something, or were you hoping to talk me out of it?" Edna Marsh bought a small bag of cornmeal she almost certainly didn't need and left. The men were less direct. At the post office, at the feed store, in the conversations that Abigail wasn't part of, but heard about through the reliable network of information that existed in any small town where women paid close attention to what men thought they weren't saying, the commentary was consistent. Jacob felt sorry for her. Jacob was being charitable. Jacob, who was known for his strategic intelligence, had made an uncharacteristically soft-hearted decision and would almost certainly regret it. Not one person in Silver Creek suggested that perhaps Jacob Thornton had simply recognized someone competent when he saw her. Abigail filed this away. She filed most things away. She had a very large and very organized internal filing system, and the category labeled "Things People Underestimate" was the largest section in it. She arrived at Carter Creek Ranch on the first Monday of August. The ranch foreman, a heavy-set man named Gerald Stokes, who had worked for the Thornton family for 11 years, met her at the door with an expression he'd clearly worked at keeping neutral and hadn't entirely succeeded. "Miss Moore," he said, "Mr. Thornton said to set you up in the East office." "Thank you," she said. "I'll get you whatever you need," Stokes said. "Books, records, whatever." "I'll need everything," she said pleasantly. "Starting from 5 years back. All ledgers, all operational logs, all vendor receipts, all employee records. Everything." Stokes blinked. "Everything." "Everything," she confirmed. He got her everything. She started working at 7 in the morning, and she was still working when Jacob came to check on her at 6 in the evening and found her surrounded by 9 open ledgers with a dense grid of figures covering both sides of 2 sheets of paper. "You've been here 11 hours, he said. "I'm aware." "Have you eaten?" She looked up. The question surprised her enough that her careful composure slipped slightly. Just slightly. Just for a moment. No one had asked her that in a professional context before. No one in a professional context had thought to ask. "I'll eat when I finish this section," she said. "You'll eat now," he said. Martha's kept supper warm. It wasn't a command exactly. It was stated with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who had decided that was how it was going to be, but without the tone that would have made it authoritarian. It was, Abigail realized, the way you spoke to someone you considered a colleague, an equal. She ate supper in the ranch kitchen with Jacob and an older woman named Martha Crane, who cooked for the ranch and had opinions about everything and shared them without apology. Martha talked through most of the meal, which Abigail appreciated, because it meant she could eat and listen and observe without being required to perform sociability. She didn't have reserves for after 11 hours of concentrated work. Jacob ate quietly and watched Abigail when he thought she wasn't noticing. She noticed. She always noticed everything, but she said nothing about it. Afterward, walking back to the East office to retrieve her notes, Jacob fell into step beside her. "You found something more today," he said. It wasn't a question. "I found 3 things," she said. "But I want to verify them before I tell you what they mean. One of them, if I'm reading it correctly, is significantly worse than what we discussed at the store. Jacob stopped walking. How significantly worse? Abigail stopped too. She looked at him in the evening light, at the set of his jaw, at the controlled steadiness of his expression, that she had already learned was not natural stillness, but deliberate control, the effort of a man who felt things deeply and had made a decision somewhere along the way to feel them privately. "Mr. Thornton," she said carefully, "if what I think I'm reading is accurate, this goes beyond an inside employee helping himself to ranch money. Someone is preparing a legal mechanism to force a lien against Carter Creek." She watched his face. "And they're close to having everything they need to do it." The silence lasted several seconds. "Tell me who you think is involved," Jacob said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But whoever it is, they have access to both your finances and your legal history. That narrows it considerably." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. "Abigail," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed not to notice he'd done it. "Don't stop until you know." "I wasn't planning to," she said. 2 weeks in the town's narrative had already hardened into something specific and wrong. Abigail heard the fullest version of it from her friend Nora Calloway, who ran the dressmaker's shop, and who made it her personal mission to ensure Abigail was never left uninformed about what people were saying, partly out of loyalty, and partly because Nora had an inexhaustible appetite for other people's business and needed someone to share it with. "They're saying," Nora reported one Sunday afternoon, sitting across from Abigail in the back room of the general store, with a cup of coffee she'd poured herself without asking, "that you batted your eyes at Jacob Thornton at the festival, that the whole accounting job is a ruse so you can get close to him, that you've been throwing yourself at him every day at that ranch." Abigail looked up from the letter she was writing to her mother's doctor. "Nora, I know. I'm just telling you what's said. They've watched me carry ledgers back and forth in front of God and everyone. They think I'm throwing myself at a man while carrying ledgers. They think—" Nora paused, weighing something. "They think that a woman like you can't have a real reason to be close to a man like him. That the only possible explanation is that you're desperate and he's being kind." Abigail set her pen down. She looked at her friend. "Nora," she said, "do you know how much Jacob Thornton's ranch is being stolen from him in round numbers?" Nora's eyes went wide. "Stolen by someone who's had access to his trust for years. Someone who's so confident that Jacob's attention is on cattle and weather and the day-to-day work of running 1,800 acres that they assumed the numbers would never be examined too closely." She picked up her pen again. "That's what's actually happening at Carter Creek Ranch. The rest of it is just noise." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So what are you going to do about it?" "Prove it," Abigail said. "Every last number, every falsified receipt, every fraudulent payment, every forged signature." She looked up. "And then I'm going to hand Jacob Thornton the name of every person involved with evidence that will hold up in a court of territorial law." Nora stared at her. "Lord," she said softly. "The noise doesn't matter," Abigail said. "It never mattered. What matters is the work." She meant it. She always meant what she said. 3.5 weeks in, she found the deed. It was buried in a folder of vendor correspondence from 2 years prior. Misfiled deliberately or accidentally, she couldn't yet determine which between 2 sets of quarterly hay receipts. It was a copy of a land survey document, and it had 2 names on it that she had not expected to find together. One name was a land development company called Continental Range Associates based in Helena. The other name was Gerald Stokes, the ranch foreman, the man Jacob had trusted with the daily operations of Carter Creek for 11 years. Abigail sat very still for a long moment. Then she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began methodically to reconstruct exactly how long this had been in motion, how deeply it had penetrated, and what it would take to undo it. She worked through the night. At 4 a.m, Jacob found her still at the desk, surrounded by a new configuration of open ledgers, a timeline drawn out across 3 connected sheets of paper, and a small specific pile of documents that she had separated from the rest, with a strip of red ribbon she'd found in her coat pocket. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Abigail," he said quietly. "I know who it is," she said. Her voice was even. Her hands were steady. "And I know how they did it, and I know why they thought they'd succeed." She looked up at him. "I also know that if we don't move in the next 10 days, it will be too late to stop the lien." Jacob crossed the room and stood in front of her desk. He looked at the documents. He looked at the timeline. He looked at her face, at the particular quality of exhausted, concentrated certainty that she wore after 18 hours of sustained focus, and she watched him understand the shape of what she had found before she said another word. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The telling took 40 minutes. When she finished, the room was absolutely silent, except for the sound of the wind coming off the mountains outside the window, and Jacob Thornton stood very still with his hands braced on the edge of the desk, and his jaw set in that particular way she had already learned meant he was processing something enormous and choosing very carefully how to respond to it. "Stokes," he said finally. "Yes." 11 years. "Yes." Another long silence. "He came to Clara's funeral," Jacob said. It was barely above a quiet breath. "He helped carry the coffin." Abigail said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Some betrayals had dimensions that went beyond what words could decently reach. After a moment, Jacob straightened. He looked at Abigail directly, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not from him, not from anyone. It was the look of a man who had just understood something about another person that he hadn't fully understood before and was trying to find language for what it meant. "Abigail," he said, "I owe you. I don't have words for what I owe you." "You hired me to find this," she said. "This is what I found." "I hired you because no one else was willing to look," he said. "That's not the same thing." She met his gaze. "No," she agreed quietly. "It isn't." Outside, the Montana sky had begun almost imperceptibly to lighten at its edges. Neither of them moved. The documents sat between them on the desk, the evidence of 11 years of betrayal, the map of exactly how someone had nearly stolen everything Jacob Thornton had built, laid out in Abigail Moore's precise and careful hand. The wind moved through the dark beyond the window. And somewhere in Carter Creek Ranch, in the quiet between night and morning, something that had been broken for a long time began almost imperceptibly to shift. Jacob didn't sleep that night. Abigail knew, because she heard him moving through the house in the hour before dawn, boots on hardwood, the quiet opening and closing of the back door, the sound of him walking out to the barn, the way men who worked land always walked when they had something too large inside them to stay indoors with. She knew the pattern. Her father had done the same thing the night before the bank called in his first lone walking circuits in the dark, because standing still felt like surrendering. She packed her documents into exact order, tied them with the red ribbon, and set them in the center of the desk, where they would be the first thing Jacob saw when he came back inside. Then she sat in the chair across from the desk and waited. He came back in 40 minutes. His boots were wet from the dew on the grass. He stopped when he saw her still sitting there, and something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but a quiet recognition that she had stayed. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it was close enough that she cataloged it. "I need to know the order of what we do next," he said. "I've written it down," she said, and pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk toward him. 10 steps, in sequence. The first 3 have to happen within 48 hours, or Continental Range Associates will file their lien paperwork before we can counter it. Jacob picked up the paper. He read it without speaking. When he reached the bottom, he read it again. "You wrote this at 4 in the morning," he said. "Yes." "It's better than anything my attorney would have given me with a week's notice." "Your attorney doesn't know your records the way I do," she said simply. He set the paper down. He looked at her across the desk, at the composed, steady certainty of her, the complete absence of drama or self-congratulation. The woman who had worked through the night to save something that wasn't hers, and seemed to consider this not extraordinary, but simply necessary. "Abigail," he said, "why did you stay tonight? You could have left the documents and gone home." She considered the question honestly. "Because I needed to make sure you understood the timeline before morning," she said. And because, she stopped. Because it matters, she said finally. What they were taking from you. It matters that it gets stopped. She looked at the documents on the desk. My father worked 20 years building his store. A man came in with a fraudulent claim on the building lease and nearly took it from him in 60 days. My father caught it himself barely by spending 3 weeks reading every document twice. She met Jacob's eyes. He told me after that the worst part wasn't the money. It was the feeling that someone had decided his work didn't matter, that they could just take it. She paused. I understand that feeling. I work to make sure other people don't have to live it. The room was very quiet. Your father sounds like a good man, Jacob said. He was the best man I ever knew, she said. Until recently. She said it without thinking, and the moment it left her mouth, she felt the precise weight of it land in the space between them. Jacob Thornton heard it. She watched him hear it. Neither of them moved. Then he picked up the list of 10 steps and said, We start at 7. I'll have the horses ready. She stood. Good. I'll be ready at 6:30, she said. She left before either of them could say anything else. The first step was the county records office, 14 miles east of Silver Creek, where Abigail had identified a filing irregularity that, if corrected within the next 48 hours, would close the legal window. Continental Range Associates needed to advance their lien claim. Jacob drove the wagon. Abigail sat beside him with her document folder across her knees, reviewing her notes for the 4th time. Not because she needed to, but because having something specific to do with her hands kept the exhaustion from reaching her face. They had been on the road for 20 minutes when Jacob said without preamble, Tell me about the other 2 people. What other 2 people? You said yesterday when you first looked at the ledgers in your store that whoever did this had access to both the finances and the legal history, that it narrowed things considerably. He kept his eyes on the road. Stokes had the financial access. Who had the legal access? Abigail had been hoping he wouldn't ask that question yet. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer was going to make everything considerably more complicated. I found 2 sets of handwriting in the falsified entries, she said carefully. Stokes's writing I confirmed against signed receipts. The second set is different, more educated, formal letter construction. She paused. The signature on the Continental Range Associates correspondence, the copy I found misfiled in the vendor folder. I've seen that signature twice before in your records, both times on legal correspondence. Jacob said nothing. The wagon moved. Your previous attorney, Abigail said. Daniel Marsh. The silence that followed was not the controlled, patient silence Jacob usually maintained. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that preceded something. William Marsh's brother, Jacob said. Yes. Daniel Marsh drafted my south grazing lease. Yes. He knows every legal vulnerability in my land holdings. Yes. Jacob's hands on the reins did not change. His posture did not change. But Abigail, who had spent weeks learning to read the small things, because the large things he kept completely controlled, saw his jaw tighten in the specific way that meant he was deciding something. Helena Marsh, he said. Her family would benefit significantly if Carter Creek were compromised, Abigail said. The Marsh holdings border your south grazing land. If you lost that lease, they'd have first claim on it, Jacob finished. He exhaled slowly. The blue dress, the festival, her father standing behind her like he'd already counted the money. I don't know if Helena knew, Abigail said. I want to be fair. Children don't always know what their parents are doing. No, Jacob said. They don't. A pause. But her father knew. Her father and his brother built this together, Abigail said. Stokes was the access point inside the ranch. Daniel Marsh built the legal mechanism. William Marsh is positioned to benefit from the land acquisition. She opened her folder and removed a single document. This is the Continental Range Associates Incorporation filing. Daniel Marsh is listed as the registered agent. William Marsh is listed as primary investor. She handed it to him without looking at him. Gerald Stokes is listed as a silent partner. Jacob took the document. He didn't look at it. He looked at the road. 11 years, he said again. The words had a different weight each time he said them. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. She said it simply without embellishment, because that was the only honest way to say it. "You have nothing to be sorry for." "I know. I'm sorry anyway." The county records office was managed by a clerk named Howard Beale, who was 60 years old and deeply committed to the idea that his authority over the filing room was absolute and not subject to the urgency of other people's problems. He told Jacob that amendments to land survey cross-references required a 3-day processing window standard procedure. Nothing to be done about it. Come back Thursday. Abigail set her document folder on the counter, opened it, removed 4 specific pages, and placed them in front of Howard Beale in a precise sequence. "Mr. Beale," she said, "this is the original survey reference filed in April of 1886. This is the cross-reference as it appears in your current records. This is the discrepancy between them, specifically a parcel boundary notation that appears to have been altered after the original filing." She placed the 4th page last. "And this is the territorial statute that classifies a post-filing alteration of a boundary notation as a fraudulent modification, which means the document as it currently stands in your records is legally void and can be corrected at any time without processing delay, because void documents are not subject to standard amendment procedure." Howard Beale stared at the 4 pages. He looked at Abigail. He looked at Jacob. He looked back at the pages. "Where did you study law?" he said. "I didn't," Abigail said. "I studied numbers. The law part I read last night." The correction was filed in 45 minutes. Walking back to the wagon, Jacob said nothing for the length of the building's front steps. Then he said, "You read territorial statute last night, while also building the timeline and writing the 10-step plan." "I read quickly," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "Abigail," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "I always answer honestly." "I know you do. That's why I'm asking." He looked at her steadily. "Is there any part of this, the work, the hours, what you've found, that has been more than you agreed to, that has been unfair to ask of you?" She considered the question with the genuine seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. "This is exactly what I do. This is what I'm good at." She looked at him. "Is there something you're actually asking underneath that question?" He almost smiled again. This time it made it slightly further. "Yes, whether you're all right." The question landed somewhere in her chest in a way she hadn't anticipated and had no immediate system for processing. "I'm all right," she said. And then, because it was true, and she had a strict policy about true things, "Thank you for asking." The second step took them to Silver Creek's telegraph office, where Jacob sent 3 messages to his attorney in Helena, to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, and to a U.S. Marshal, whose name he wrote from memory without consulting any document, which told Abigail that this was not a man who had been completely unprepared for the possibility of betrayal only for its specific shape. While he was inside, Abigail sat on the bench outside the office and became aware that she was being watched. Across the street in front of the dry goods store, Helena Marsh stood with 2 other women of her particular social circle. Helena was wearing a yellow dress today, not the blue silk from the festival, and she was looking at Abigail with an expression that Abigail couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't hostility exactly. It wasn't pity. It was something more unsettled than either of those. Abigail looked back at her directly. Helena looked away first. One of the women with Helena leaned close and said something. Helena shook her head once sharply. The 3 of them walked on. Abigail filed this away in the category labeled, "Things that will become relevant later." Jacob came out of the telegraph office, and they moved on. By the end of the 48 hours, the first 3 steps were complete. The legal window for Continental Range Associates lion filing had been closed. The Territorial Land Commissioner had been formally notified of the fraudulent boundary modification. And Jacob's attorney in Helena, a sharp-minded man named Foster, who apparently owed Jacob a considerable personal debt, had agreed to arrive in Silver Creek within 5 days with the legal framework for what came next. What came next? Abigail had decided was going to require the kind of precision that left no gaps for the other side to exploit. She was back in the East office at Carter Creek Ranch. The day's work laid out in front of her when she became aware that Gerald Stokes was standing in the doorway. He had never come to the East office before. In 5 weeks of working at the ranch, he had always maintained a careful distance from her workspace, sending whatever she requested through a junior ranch hand, never delivering things himself, never engaging beyond strict professional necessity. She looked up at him. "Miss Moore," he said. His voice was careful. His expression was careful. Everything about him, she realized, had always been careful. She'd noticed it peripherally and filed it under "man who guards his responses" without fully interrogating why. She interrogated it now. "Mr. Stokes," she said. He stepped into the room without being invited. "I've been hearing talk," he said, "in town, about why Mr. Thornton hired you." "People talk," she said evenly. "They do." He looked at the documents on her desk, not with specific attention, she thought, but with the broad awareness of a man trying to determine how much she knew without asking directly. "I wanted to say, I've always thought Mr. Thornton's records were handled fine. Tom Pierce's system was solid. His son maybe wasn't the same caliber, but—" "Mr. Stokes," Abigail said, "is there something specific you needed?" A pause. "Just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." "I have everything I need," she said. "Thank you." He stood there one moment longer than was natural. Then he left. Abigail waited until she heard his boots on the stairs. Then she opened her top drawer, removed a fresh sheet of paper, and wrote the date, the time, and a single sentence: "Gerald Stokes visited the East office unprompted. Asked indirectly about the scope of my work." She added it to the evidence folder. 20 minutes later, she heard the sound of a horse being saddled quickly in the yard below. She went to the window and watched Gerald Stokes ride out of Carter Creek Ranch at a pace that was significantly faster than any routine errand required. She wrote a second note. Stokes left the ranch at speed. Direction Silver Creek Southwest Road. She folded both notes and put them in her coat pocket. When Jacob came in from the North Fields an hour later, she handed him the folded notes without comment. He read them. His expression didn't change. He said, "He knows we know." "He suspects," she said. "Which is nearly the same thing, but not quite. We have 4 days before your attorney arrives. Stokes will go to Daniel Marsh. Daniel Marsh will assess whether they can accelerate their timeline." She looked at Jacob. "They can't. I've closed the window, but they'll try to create a different kind of pressure." "What kind?" She hesitated. "The kind that doesn't go through the courts," she said carefully. Jacob understood immediately. "My reputation. Yes, if they can't take the ranch legally, they'll try to make running it impossible. They'll attack your credibility, your relationships, your standing in the community." She met his eyes. "And the most efficient way to do that right now is to attack the judgment that led you to hire me." The words sat between them plainly. "They'll go after you," Jacob said. "They'll go after the story of why you hired me," she said. "They'll make it something shameful, something that makes the community question your decisions. If the community questions your decisions, then my word against theirs carries less weight." "Yes." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not going to let them do that." "I know," she said. "But I want you to be prepared for what it will look like when they try." She was prepared for it herself. She had been preparing for it in the careful interior way she prepared for everything since the morning she'd signed the contract. She had known with the clear-eyed certainty of a woman who had spent 26 years being the person a town felt comfortable dismissing that the moment she became inconvenient to someone powerful, the attack would not come at her work. It would come at her person. She was right. It started subtly, the way these things always start. A comment at the feed store overheard by 3 people. An insinuation at the post office that was worded carefully enough to deny if challenged. The particular way that Edna Marsh began speaking to other women of her social circle over Sunday services, not saying anything specific, just planting questions. Wasn't it unusual the length of hours Abigail Moore spent at a bachelor's ranch? Wasn't it interesting that Jacob Thornton, who had always been so careful with his associations, had chosen such an unexpected person for such intimate access to his affairs? The word intimate did a great deal of work in Edna Marsh's vocabulary. Nora Calloway arrived at Abigail's store on a Wednesday evening with the expression she wore when she had something to report that she found simultaneously appalling and impossible not to share. "They're saying," Nora began, and Abigail held up one hand. "I know what they're saying," she said. "You know, I've known for 5 days that it was coming." She poured Nora a cup of coffee. "Tell me the specific version. I need to know how far they've taken it." Nora told her. The specific version was worse than Abigail had anticipated, and she had anticipated something fairly bad. The story circulating, and it had the smooth, polished quality of a story that had been deliberately shaped rather than organically grown, was that Abigail Moore had approached Jacob Thornton at the Harvest Festival under the pretense of accounting knowledge that the accounting job was a fabrication to disguise a calculated campaign to position herself as marriageable, and that Jacob, who was known for his fundamental decency, was too kind-hearted to have seen through it. The accounting the story implied was a cover. The real transaction was loneliness exploiting generosity. "And people believe this," Abigail said. Nora's expression answered before she spoke. "Some do. Enough." A pause. "Abigail, is there, I need to ask, is there something real between you and Jacob Thornton? Because if there is, there's no shame in—" "I'm doing a job," Abigail said. "That's what's real." "Of course," Nora said quickly. "I know that. I want to understand what you want me to say when people ask." Abigail thought about that. "Tell them," she said slowly, "that Abigail Moore has always done exactly what she said she'd do, and that anyone who wants to know what she's actually doing at Carter Creek Ranch is welcome to look at the books when this is done." She met Nora's eyes. All of them. Jacob heard the stories on Thursday. She knew because he arrived at the East office that afternoon with a particular quality of contained anger that she had not seen in him before. Not the deep, private grief of the night she'd told him about Stokes, but something more immediate and sharp. "Tell me you know about what they're saying in town," he said. "I've known for a week," she said. "Sit down, Mr. Thornton." He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. "They are deliberately destroying your reputation to protect themselves. I know what you want to do," she said. "Don't." "Abigail." "Not yet," she said. "If you respond now before we have everything in order, you give them a reaction to use against you. You make it a personal conflict instead of a legal fraud case." She looked at him steadily. 4 days. Foster arrives in 4 days. We have everything we need. Let them talk for 4 more days, and then we answer them in the only language that matters. Jacob looked at her. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something she identified after a moment as a kind of wondering, the expression of a man encountering something repeatedly that he hadn't expected to encounter and still hadn't quite found the right category for. "How are you so calm?" he said. "I'm not calm," she said honestly. "I'm focused. They're different things." He exhaled. He finally came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, the same chair she'd sat in the morning she'd waited for him to come back from the barn. He set his hat on his knee. "My mother used to say that," he said, "that focus and calm were different. She said calm was a feeling and focus was a choice." "Your mother was right," Abigail said. "She was right about most things." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you." The sentence arrived with the particular weight of something said without premeditation, and Abigail felt it the same way she'd felt the question about whether she was all right somewhere that didn't have an efficient filing system. She said nothing. She looked back at her documents. After a moment, Jacob said, "Tell me where we are, all of it," she told him. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the full picture together, every fraudulent entry, every forged signature, every manufactured land document, the complete architecture of what Continental Range Associates had built over 3 years and what Stokes had fed them for 11. By the end of it, Jacob understood the case as well as she did, could speak to every evidence point, could explain the legal mechanism and why it would hold. At the end, he looked at everything laid out on the desk and said, "They really thought they'd succeed. They thought no one would ever look closely enough," she said. "They were almost right." "Not almost," he said. They were completely wrong. They just didn't know it yet. She looked up. He was looking at her with that same wondering expression, and this time he didn't look away. "I need to say something to you," he said. "And I need you to let me say it plainly without redirecting it back to the work." She went still. "In 7 years," Jacob said, "since Clara, I stopped expecting to find someone I could trust completely. Not because I stopped wanting to, because I stopped believing that kind of trust was still available to me." He looked at the documents between them. "You have worked for 6 weeks with more honesty and more courage than anyone I've ever hired or known, or—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't know what this is yet. I'm not a man who moves fast or says things he doesn't mean. But I need you to know that what's happening in this town, what they're saying about you, it makes me angrier than the fraud does. Because the fraud I can fight in court." He met her eyes. "What they're saying about you is an injustice I can't file a legal motion against." Abigail sat very still. "Jacob," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name. They both noticed. "Yes," he said. "Right now," she said carefully. "We have a fraud case to finish and 4 days to finish it in." She held his gaze. "Ask me again when Stokes is arrested and Foster has filed the motion and Carter Creek Ranch is safe." A silence. "All right," Jacob said. "And then I'll ask again." She nodded once. She looked back at her documents. Her hands under the desk where he couldn't see them were not entirely steady. Foster arrived from Helena on the 5th day, as promised. A lean, quick-minded attorney of 50 who shook Abigail's hand with the directness of a man who had learned to recognize competence, regardless of its packaging, reviewed her evidence summary in 3 hours, and said flat and final, "This is the cleanest fraud case I've seen in 15 years of territorial law. Every element is documented, cross-referenced, and independently verifiable." He looked at Jacob. "Where did you find her?" "She found herself," Jacob said. "I just had the sense to ask." Foster turned back to Abigail. "Can you be in court on Monday?" "Yes," she said. "Good," Foster said. "Because you're the primary witness, and I want to walk through the evidence sequence with you this weekend." He closed the evidence folder. "One more thing." He looked between Jacob and Abigail. "When this goes to court, and it will go fast, the case is airtight. The people who built this story about Miss Moore are going to find themselves publicly contradicted by the evidence. Everyone who believed them is going to have to reckon with what they believed." He looked specifically at Abigail. "That's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Some of them will apologize, some won't. I want you to be prepared for both." "I've been prepared for both my entire life," Abigail said. Foster studied her for a moment. Then he said to Jacob, "She's prepared." Jacob looked at Abigail, and in his expression was something she was finally reluctantly beginning to allow herself to name. "Yes," he said quietly. "She is." Outside, the late afternoon sun was cutting long gold lines across the Montana sky and somewhere in Silver Creek. Gerald Stokes and Daniel Marsh were making their last calculations, completely unaware that the woman they had dismissed as irrelevant had already counted every card in their hand. The weekend before the court filing, Abigail didn't sleep more than 3 hours on either night. Not because she was afraid. Fear was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and she had long ago replaced it with something more functional, a kind of heightened, precise attention that sharpened everything around her into complete clarity. She lay awake because her mind kept running the evidence sequence from beginning to end, checking every link in the chain, looking for the gap that Foster might have missed, that she might have missed the single weak joint that a good defense attorney could wedge open and crack the whole structure apart. She found nothing. She ran it again anyway. By Sunday morning, she had the entire case memorized in a sequence so exact she could have recited every document, every date, every discrepancy, and its corresponding verification without looking at a single page. Foster spent 4 hours walking through the testimony framework with her, and at the end of it, he set down his pen and said, "I've prepped a lot of witnesses in my career. You're the best I've ever worked with. I'm not trying to be a good witness," she said. "I'm trying to make sure the truth is impossible to misunderstand." "That's what makes you a good witness," he said. Jacob sat in the corner of the ranch office during the preparation session and said almost nothing. He listened. He watched Abigail work through the evidence with the focused efficiency of a surgeon, and once, when Foster challenged her on a specific date correlation that seemed thin, watched her pull the exact corresponding receipt from memory and recite the page number before Foster had finished his question. Jacob said nothing. But Abigail, who always noticed everything, saw him look at Foster with an expression that was quiet and certain and not entirely without pride. She stored that too in the filing system that had no official category yet. Monday arrived the way consequential days always arrived, without ceremony, without the dramatic weight that the preceding days had accumulated. Just a regular Montana morning, a sky going gray before the sun. The sound of the ranch waking up around her as she dressed in her best clothes, which were not impressive by Silver Creek standards, but were clean and pressed and exactly right for a woman who had decided that what she wore to court was her least important variable. Gerald Stokes was arrested at 6:15 in the morning. 2 deputies from the Territorial Marshal's office came to Carter Creek Ranch before the household was fully awake. Abigail heard the horses in the yard, heard the low exchange of voices, heard the particular sound of a man being told something he cannot argue with because there is a badge attached to the telling. She heard Stokes say something she couldn't make out. Then silence. Then boots on gravel moving toward a horse. She looked out the window and watched Gerald Stokes ride away between 2 deputies in the early morning light, his hands not in irons. He had come quietly, which she had predicted, because men like Stokes were fundamentally cautious, and his back perfectly straight. The posture of a man who had not yet decided what face to wear for what came next. 11 years, she thought. He had come to Clara Thornton's funeral. He had helped carry the coffin. She turned away from the window and went downstairs. Jacob was standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He looked up when she came in. "You heard," he said. "Yes." "Daniel Marsh was picked up at his office in Silver Creek 20 minutes ago," Jacob said. "Foster's man was there." He set down the coffee cup. "William Marsh has apparently left town." Abigail absorbed this. When, yesterday evening, someone warned him. "Someone," she said carefully. "Did Foster's contact have any information on who?" "Not yet." Jacob looked at her steadily. "Does it change anything legally?" "No. William Marsh's involvement is documented independently of his presence. Foster can proceed without him. But," she paused thinking, "his absence will give people in this town a story to fill in for themselves. And people filling in stories they don't have the facts for tend to fill them in wrong. What's the wrong story they'll fill in? That there's more they haven't been told. That the case is weaker than it appears. That something was handled improperly." She met his eyes. "That I had something to do with it." Jacob's jaw tightened. "That's predictable," she said. "Not impossible to counter, but we need to be careful today." She picked up her document folder from the table where she'd left it the night before. "Are you ready?" He looked at her, at the composed, certain, completely unadorned steadiness of her, and something moved through his expression that he didn't try to control. "Yes," he said. "Let's go." The county courthouse in Silver Creek was a single-story building that served simultaneously as the territorial court, the land records office, and on alternating Tuesdays a meeting room for the Silver Creek Merchants Association. It was not a grand space, but it was that Monday morning completely full. Word had traveled the way. Word always traveled in a town this size instantaneously and with embellishment. By the time Abigail and Jacob arrived with Foster, there were at least 60 people gathered in and around the building, which represented a significant portion of Silver Creek's permanent population. Ranching families, merchants, several women from the social circle that Edna Marsh had spent weeks carefully working with her whisper campaign. All of them watching as Jacob Thornton walked up the courthouse steps with his attorney and his accountant, neither of whom looked remotely concerned about what was about to happen. Abigail felt the watching. She was experienced with being watched in ways that were not kind. She kept her folder in her arms and her eyes on the door. Helena Marsh was standing near the left side of the entrance, slightly apart from the crowd. She was not dressed for social performance today, No blue silk, no careful arrangement. She looked like a woman who had woken up to discover that the ground she'd been standing on had shifted without warning, and who was still working out how to stand on the new configuration. When Abigail passed her, their eyes met briefly. Helena opened her mouth. Abigail kept walking. Whatever Helena had been about to say, she didn't say it. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Foster presented the evidence with the methodical precision of a man who had done this many times and understood that in a fraud case of this complexity, clarity was more powerful than drama. He walked the court through every document, every discrepancy, every verification. He called Abigail to the stand and asked her to explain in plain language that any ranching family in Montana could follow exactly what had been done to Carter Creek Ranch, how long it had been done, and how she had found it. She testified for 47 minutes. She spoke without notes. She answered every question directly and completely, including the 3 attempts by Daniel Marsh's hastily assembled defense attorney to imply that her findings were speculative, each of which she countered with the specific document page number and corresponding verification that made speculation impossible. At one point, the defense attorney said, with the particular condescension of a man who had decided his best strategy was to undermine the witness's credibility rather than challenge the evidence, "Miss Moore, you are, as I understand it, a shopkeeper. Is that correct?" "I am a bookkeeper," Abigail said. "I also operate a general store. The distinction matters because a bookkeeper is what I was hired to be, and bookkeeping is what I did." She looked at him calmly. "Would you like me to explain the difference between the two, or shall we continue with the evidence?" Several people in the gallery made sounds. The judge, a dry, precise man of 60, named Harmon, who had been dispensing territorial justice for 20 years and had a considerable tolerance for neither nonsense nor delay, told the defense attorney to proceed without the editorializing. The defense attorney did not try that approach again. When Daniel Marsh himself was questioned, he said nothing. He had his attorney explained, been advised to make no statements at this time. He sat at his table with the careful blankness of a man who had calculated that silence was his best remaining position, and who was right about that, and who knew he was right, and who was not comforted by being right. Gerald Stokes at the table beside him could not maintain the same composure. He was a physical man, accustomed to managing things with his hands and his presence and his 11 years of accumulated authority. Sitting in a courthouse, listening to every decision of the past 3 years, read aloud from documents he'd assumed were hidden, was a different kind of confinement, and it showed in the way he sat too still, in the way people are too still when stillness is costing them something. When the judge ruled fraud, established lion filing, voided property titles, restored to their correct legal status, both defendants remanded pending full trial. The courtroom was briefly very quiet. Then it was not quiet at all. Abigail was standing on the courthouse steps, her folder tucked under her arm, when Edna Marsh came to her. She had not expected this. She had mentally prepared for the aftermath of the hearing in several configurations. The apologies that Foster had predicted, some people would offer the silence of those who wouldn't, the recalibration that a community went through when a story it had collectively believed turned out to be wrong. She had not specifically prepared for Edna Marsh approaching her directly on the courthouse steps, with the bearing of a woman who had spent her whole life moving through the world with a particular kind of authority, and had just discovered that authority had a weight limit. Edna stopped in front of her. Her daughter Helena was 2 steps behind her. "Miss Moore," Edna said. She stopped there, as if the name had used up all the prepared material. Abigail waited. "My brother-in-law," Edna began. She stopped again. Her composure, which was elaborate and long maintained, was visibly working hard. "I did not know the full extent of what Daniel was. I want you to understand that I had no—" "Mrs. Marsh," Abigail said, not unkindly. "I believe you." Edna blinked. "You do. You're a woman who trades in social currency, in what people think and what people say. If you'd known about a criminal fraud operation, you would have understood the risk it posed to your family's position far too clearly to let it continue." Abigail looked at her steadily. "You weren't part of it, but you were part of what happened afterward. The things you said, The questions you planted. Edna's chin lifted slightly. I was protecting your family, Abigail said. I understand that impulse. I've been protecting my family since I was 19 years old. She paused. But Mrs. Marsh, you protected them by trying to destroy my reputation. And you should know that. The silence between them was long and uncomfortable and completely honest. Yes, Edna Marsh said finally. Her voice was quieter than Abigail had ever heard it. I should know that. Helena, who had said nothing during this exchange, looked at Abigail with that same unsettled expression from the courthouse entrance. Something between apology and a more complicated reckoning that she clearly hadn't finished having with herself. I'm sorry, Helena said. It was simple and direct, and nothing like what Abigail would have expected from her. For the things that were said about you. She stopped. For all of it. Abigail looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said. She meant it. She walked down the remaining steps and didn't look back. Jacob found her 20 minutes later, standing at the wagon, having one of the most unexpected conversations of her life, with a 70-year-old ranching patriarch named August Cole, who had lost 50 acres of grazing rights to a Continental Range Associates filing 2 years ago, and had spent those 2 years assuming he'd simply made a legal error. He hadn't. He'd been defrauded by the same mechanism that had targeted Carter Creek. When Jacob arrived, August Cole was gripping Abigail's hand in both of his enormous weathered ones and saying, Young woman, I have been in this territory for 43 years, and I have never been as relieved to be wrong about something as I am right now. Abigail said, Get everything you have to Foster this week. He'll file a recovery motion. You'll have your land back. August looked at Jacob. You got a remarkable woman here, Thornton. Jacob looked at Abigail. Yes, he said, I do. August Cole walked back toward the courthouse to find Foster and Abigail stood with Jacob beside the wagon in the middle of Silver Creek, and the town moved around them, and the conversation from 3 nights ago, ask me again when it's done, was present between them, like a third person standing very quietly to the side. Well, Abigail said. Well, Jacob said. Foster will need me for the full trial, she said. That's another few weeks of work. I know. I should finish going through the operational records too. There may be vendor relationships that need to be unwound. I know. And my mother's doctor is coming Thursday, and I'll need... Abigail, Jacob said. She stopped. I was looking at her with the expression she had been refusing to fully read for weeks, and this time she let herself read it. It was the expression of a man who had waited 7 years and had fully intended to wait longer until the waiting had become something he could no longer find any reasonable argument for. I asked you to let me ask again when this was done, he said. I remember, she said. It's done. She looked at him. I know, she said quietly. He reached into his coat pocket and took out something small. She looked down at it. A ring, not elaborate. Not the kind of thing that announced itself from across a room. A simple gold band with a single small stone that caught the afternoon light in a way that was understated and completely serious. I didn't buy this today, he said. I want you to know that. I bought it 11 days ago. He met her eyes. When you were in the county records office explaining void documents to Howard Beale, she looked up from the ring. That's when, she said. I watched you dismantle an institutional obstacle using a statute you'd read the night before, while also building a legal timeline and writing a 10-step plan, he said. And I thought this woman is extraordinary. And I also thought I would like to spend the rest of my life watching her solve problems. He paused. So yes, that's when. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. She was aware that they were standing in the middle of Silver Creek's main street. She was aware that they were visible from the courthouse steps from the feed store, from at least 4 windows she could identify without looking directly at them. She was aware that this was by every external measure exactly the kind of public moment that her life had conspicuously lacked. Jacob, she said, I'm a shopkeeper and a bookkeeper from the poor end of town, and everyone in this county spent the last 6 weeks saying, I manipulated you for personal gain. I know what everyone said, he said. I also know what's true. He held her gaze. I have spent 7 years being very careful. I don't make decisions without understanding them fully." His voice was steady and quiet and completely certain. "I understand this one. You barely know me," she said. But even as she said it, she heard how inaccurate it was. Jacob heard it too. "I know that you stayed up all night for a cause that wasn't yours because justice mattered to you more than sleep. I know that you stood in front of Randall Dutton's cruelty and didn't flinch and didn't perform. I know that when I said my mother would have liked you, I meant she would have loved you." He paused. "And I know that you have been the most honest person in every room you've entered since the day I met you." He looked at the ring in his hand. "I know enough." The Montana afternoon moved around them. Somewhere behind her, a horse shifted its weight. A door opened and closed. The ordinary sounds of a town going about its business entirely unaware. Abigail looked at the ring. She thought about her father's store, and the fraudulent lease claim, and the 3 weeks he'd spent reading every document twice. She thought about her mother's hands in winter, making sachets, because the making of things was the language she used when words weren't sufficient. She thought about 26 years of being the woman a town felt comfortable looking past, and the particular discipline that took, and what it had built in her, and how it turned out that what it had built was exactly what Jacob Thornton had been looking for without knowing he was looking. "Yes," she said. It was one word. It was not a small word. Jacob Thornton put the ring on Abigail Moore's finger on the main street of Silver Creek, Montana Territory, in full view of the courthouse and the feed store and the 4 windows she'd identified. And it was not a theatrical gesture, and it was not accompanied by anything dramatic, because neither of them were people who needed drama to confirm what was real. What was real needed no confirmation. It simply was. They were back at the wagon, and Jacob was helping her up to the seat when the door of the courthouse opened and a group of people came out together. Foster, 2 ranching families. She recognized August Cole. Several other men who had been inside for the aftermath of the hearing. They saw Jacob and Abigail at the wagon. Someone she didn't see who started clapping. It spread quickly, the way genuine things spread without orchestration. August Cole was clapping with his enormous weathered hands, his face split by the widest expression a man of his particular stoic formation was apparently capable of producing. The ranching families. The 2 men from the territorial commissioner's office. Even one of the deputies who had arrested Stokes that morning standing near the building's corner with his hat in his hand. Abigail sat up on the wagon seat and looked at the small assembly of people applauding on the Silver Creek courthouse steps, and felt something move through her that she couldn't name precisely because it had no precedent in her experience. It wasn't triumph. It was quieter than triumph and more durable. It was the feeling of a thing being recognized. She had worked all her life to be seen for what she was, rather than for what she appeared to be. She had spent 26 years in a town that had decided to see the surface and stop there. And now on a Monday afternoon in August, the surface had been turned over. Jacob sat beside her on the wagon seat. He didn't make any gesture toward the people clapping. He just looked at Abigail. "Ready to go home," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. The dinner that Foster hosted that evening at the Silver Creek Hotel was attended by 14 people, the core group from the courthouse, the ranching families who had been affected by Continental Range Associates, Jacob, Abigail, and Nora Calloway, who had not been invited but had arrived anyway, and whom nobody asked to leave because her determination to be present at significant moments was too fundamental to her character to be reasonably opposed. It was at this dinner 3 hours in when Foster stood and raised his glass and said something that Abigail would remember for a very long time. "To the woman," Foster said, "who found in 6 weeks what 3 years of fraud had buried. Who did it with honesty, precision, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself." He looked at Abigail directly. "Silver Creek is a richer place for knowing you, Miss Moore. And Carter Creek Ranch still stands because you decided its numbers mattered." 14 people raised their glasses. Abigail sat with her water glass, she didn't drink, raised halfway, and looked at the faces around the table and thought, "This is what it feels like. Not to be liked. Not to be pretty enough or charming enough or positioned correctly at the right festival booth. This is what it feels like to be known." Nora, sitting to her left, leaned close and said very quietly, "Is that a ring on your finger, Abigail Moore?" Abigail looked at her. "Yes," she said. Nora made a sound that was not entirely unlike the sound of someone who had been waiting for a very specific outcome for a very long time, finally receiving it. Then she composed herself, straightened in her chair, raised her glass, and said nothing more. Across the table, Jacob was watching Abigail with the particular expression she had finally allowed herself to name and had discovered had no single word equivalent in any language she knew. It was something made of recognition and certainty, and the specific quality of a person who has found the thing he had been looking for and intends to hold on to it. She met his eyes. She held them. Outside Silver Creek settled into the Montana evening, a town that had woken up that morning with one story and gone to bed with another. A community in the first hours of reckoning with what it had believed and why, and what that said about the distance between a person's surface and their truth. Inside the hotel dining room, Abigail Moore sat with a ring on her finger and 14 people who had seen her work and knew her worth, and thought about the wedding she would plan with her mother, and the records she still needed to finish at Carter Creek, and the vendor relationships that needed unwinding, and the South grazing lease that now, with the lien voided, Jacob could renew without obstacle. She thought about all of it in the organized, forward-moving way. She thought about everything, and she smiled. It was a complete smile. It started in her eyes, and it was, for anyone paying attention, the most beautiful thing in that room. The morning after the engagement, Silver Creek woke up with a different face. Abigail noticed it the moment she unlocked the general store at 7 o'clock. 3 women walked past the window in the first 10 minutes, each one slowing slightly at the glass, each one performing the particular body language of people who wanted to look without appearing to look. By 8 o'clock, 2 customers had come in and bought things they clearly hadn't needed: a pound of salt from a woman who had bought salt the previous week, a spool of thread from a woman whose sewing basket Abigail happened to know was already well stocked. Both of them lingered. Both of them said nothing about the ring on Abigail's left hand, which meant both of them had noticed it immediately. The third customer was different. Margaret Pruitt was 64 years old, had ranched the Pruitt land north of Silver Creek for 37 years alongside her late husband, and had a reputation for saying exactly what she thought, with the kind of directness that came from a life lived too practically to waste time on indirection. She came through the door at 8:20, bought nothing, walked directly to the counter, looked at Abigail's left hand and said, "Good." Abigail looked up. "Mrs. Pruitt?" "I said good," Margaret repeated. "I've watched this town treat you like furniture for 6 years. A piece that's useful, but that nobody particularly wants to look at." She set both hands flat on the counter. "I want you to know I never believed what was being said, not for a day." "I know," Abigail said. "You were one of the first families to hire me for bookkeeping, because you were the best person for the job," Margaret said bluntly. "That's the only reason I hire anyone for anything." She straightened. "Jacob Thornton is a sensible man, always has been. What he's done makes complete sense to any person willing to use their eyes for something beyond confirming what they already believe." She looked at the ring. "When's the wedding?" "We haven't set a date yet," Abigail said. "There's still the full trial to get through." "Don't wait on the trial," Margaret said. "Life doesn't pause for legal proceedings. I've waited on 3 things in my life that I should have done without waiting, and I regret all 3. She turned for the door, then stopped. "You'll make a fine ranching wife, Abigail. Not because you're marrying a rancher, because you understand what it costs to build something and what it costs to protect it." She pushed the door open. "Not everyone does." She left. Abigail stood at the counter for a moment, with the kind of fullness in her chest that had no practical application, and that she therefore didn't know entirely what to do with. Then she opened her ledger and went back to work. Foster's full trial preparation took 3 weeks, during which Abigail functioned simultaneously as the case's primary witness, the ongoing financial auditor for Carter Creek Ranch, and the manager of her mother's care, which had grown more demanding as September arrived, and her mother's breathing became less reliable in the cooling air. She did all 3 without complaint, and without telling Jacob how thin she was stretched, which meant Jacob found out not from her, but from Nora, who had no policy against sharing relevant information with people she considered adequately motivated to act on it. Jacob appeared at the general store on a Thursday evening with the particular expression of a man who has just been informed of something he should have noticed himself, and is directing his frustration at his own inattention rather than at the person who told him. "Nora told me about your mother," he said, coming through the door. Abigail, who was in the middle of closing the accounts for the day, didn't look up immediately. "Nora talks." "Nora is right," Jacob said. He came to the counter and waited until she looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's manageable. It shouldn't only be managed by you." "Jacob." "She's going to be my mother-in-law," he said. It was the first time either of them had used that word, that framing the forward-reaching language of a future that was real and not hypothetical. It landed with quiet weight. "That means her care is our responsibility, not yours alone." Abigail set down her pen. She looked at him carefully. "I have been managing things alone for a long time," she said. "I don't always remember immediately that I don't have to anymore." Something shifted in Jacob's expression. Not softening exactly, he was not a soft man, but a kind of careful opening. "Remember now," he said. She nodded once. He arranged for Dr. Harlan, the best physician in the territory, to see her mother the following week. He sent Martha Crane from the ranch kitchen 3 mornings a week to help with meals. He did all of this practically and without ceremony, the way he did everything, not as a performance of generosity, but as a simple recognition of what needed doing and who was positioned to do it. Abigail's mother. Ruth Moore was a small woman who had been made smaller by illness, but whose mind remained entirely clear, and whose powers of observation, Abigail had always privately believed exceeded even her own. She met Jacob Thornton for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon and spent the first 20 minutes asking him questions that were direct to the point of being almost interrogatory. What was his South grazing lease situation now that the lion was voided? Did he understand the 5-year implications of the feed cost inflation on his herd quality? What was his succession plan for the ranch if something happened to him? Jacob answered every question directly and completely. Ruth Moore listened. Then she looked at her daughter, who was sitting in the corner pretending to review documents, and said, "He answers questions the way you do." Abigail looked up. "What way is that?" Jacob asked. "Like the truth is the only available option," Ruth said. "Most people pause before answering a hard question. You don't. Abigail doesn't either." She settled back against her chair. "It means you were both raised to believe that honesty has lower costs than dishonesty. Not everyone was raised that way." "No," Jacob agreed. "They weren't." Ruth looked at him for one more long moment. Then she said, "You'll do." Jacob almost smiled. Fully this time. It was the most complete version of the expression Abigail had ever seen on him, and she stored it in the category that still had no official name, but that had by this point grown quite large. The full trial opened on the second Monday of September. Daniel Marsh arrived with a Helena attorney who was expensive and skilled, and who spent the first day attempting to establish that Abigail's evidence, while technically accurate in its individual components, represented a pattern of interpretation rather than documented fact. It was a reasonable strategy, the only reasonable strategy available, and it required Abigail called to the stand on the second day to dismantle it piece by piece in front of a courtroom that was again packed to its physical capacity. The Helena attorney was good. He was better than the defense attorney at the initial hearing, and he came prepared with specific challenges to specific documents, each of which he had clearly studied and identified as the weakest links. His first challenge was to the March feed purchase discrepancy, the entry Abigail had identified in the general store 9 weeks earlier as the first evidence of deliberate fraud. He argued that the discrepancy could be explained by a recording error in the operational log, a simple miscounting of the cattle transferred to Billings, a mistake rather than a manipulation. Abigail said, "Turn to page 43 of the operational log." She waited while the document was located. The Billings transfer is recorded in detail, 60 head 2 drovers, 3 days transit. The date is March the 15th. She paused. Now turn to the feed purchase ledger page 14, the March 4th entry. That entry was made 11 days before the cattle left. If it were a recording error tied to the transfer, the error would post-date the transfer, not precede it by nearly 2 weeks. She looked at the attorney. Would you like me to explain what precede means in the context of fraud documentation, or shall we continue? A sound moved through the courtroom gallery. The judge did not suppress it. The Helena attorney moved to his second challenge. It went the same way. By the fourth challenge, he had adopted a different approach, less direct confrontation of specific documents, more broad questioning of Abigail's methodology, her qualifications, her right to draw the conclusions she had drawn. "Miss Moore," he said, with the careful tone of a man setting up something he believed would land effectively, "you have presented yourself throughout these proceedings as an expert in financial documentation. But I want to establish for the court, you hold no formal qualification in law, no degree in accounting from any institution, no certification from any professional body." He looked at the court. "You are in the end a woman who keeps books for local families as a side business while running a small general store. Is that correct?" The courtroom was very quiet. Abigail looked at him. "It is correct," she said evenly, "that I hold no formal degree. It is also correct that I learned double-entry bookkeeping at age 11 from my father, who learned it from a trained accountant in Boston, and that I have kept financial records for 17 families in this valley for 7 years without a single error that was ever disputed." She paused. "It is additionally correct that the fraud I identified and documented in these proceedings has been independently verified by Mr. Foster, who holds both a law degree and 30 years of experience in territorial fraud cases." She looked at the attorney with the complete calm of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that the attempt no longer costs her anything. "The question before this court is not my credentials. The question is whether the documents are accurate. They are, every single one." Foster from his table said nothing. He didn't need to. The judge ruled on the fourth day. Fraud established. Daniel Marsh, guilty on all counts. Gerald Stokes, guilty on all counts. Continental Range Associates dissolved by court order. All fraudulently obtained land filings voided. All affected property titles restored. Restitution to be calculated across all affected parties, which included, by the end of the proceedings, 7 additional families beyond Carter Creek Ranch, whose land holdings had been targeted by the same mechanism. When the verdict was read, the gallery did not erupt. There was instead a long, deep exhale, the sound of 7 families breathing out something they had been holding for too long. August Cole, sitting in the second row, put his face in his hands. His shoulders moved. He made no sound. His wife, sitting beside him, put her hand on his back and said nothing. Abigail, sitting beside Jacob at the plaintiff's table, felt him reach under the table and take her hand. He held it without looking at her. She held it back. The weeks after the verdict moved differently than the weeks before it. Before, everything had been forward pressure, the next document, the next verification, the next step on the list. Now the pressure released, and what remained was something that took Abigail longer than she expected to identify: the ordinary texture of a life that was no longer in crisis. She finished the Carter Creek Ranch audit in its entirety. Every vendor relationship examined, every fraudulent payment, mapped every figure that needed correction, corrected. She presented Jacob with a final report that was 43 pages long, and that represented, in her assessment, the most complete financial picture Carter Creek had possessed in over a decade. Jacob read all 43 pages. "This is extraordinary," he said. "It's a bookkeeping report," she said. "Everything you produce is extraordinary," he said. "You should stop being surprised when I notice." She looked at him. "I'm not surprised," she said. She paused, looking for the honest word. "Still getting used to it." "To what?" "To someone noticing." She said it plainly because that was how she said everything. "I've been doing this work for 7 years. Before you, the most enthusiastic response I ever received was from Tom Pruitt, who told me my quarterly report was very tidy." Jacob looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Abigail, you saved this ranch. You saved 7 other families' land. You did it with a level of skill and courage that I have not seen in 36 years of living and working in this territory." He met her eyes. "You should hear that clearly, not as a compliment, as a fact." She held his gaze. "All right," she said quietly. "I hear it." The apologies started slowly and then came in a rush. The way these things do in small communities, where the social architecture depends on everyone being in reasonable standing with everyone else, and where a public wrongdoing cannot be left unaddressed indefinitely without corroding the foundations. The first formal apology came from Reverend Aldridge, who visited the general store on a Wednesday morning and told Abigail that he had allowed doubt to be planted in his mind by people he trusted, and that his resulting silence when those doubts were being weaponized against her was a failure of his responsibilities that he intended to address directly from the pulpit the following Sunday. I did. Abigail didn't attend the service. She never attended services, having made her peace with whatever was larger than human understanding in private rather than public. But Nora reported the full text of his remarks with the precision of a woman who had listened hard and remembered everything. The second apology came from Robert Dutton Randall's father, who arrived at Carter Creek Ranch on a Friday afternoon while Abigail was working in the East office, and who stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the specific expression of a man who has had a conversation with his son that he found both necessary and deeply unpleasant. "My boy said some things at the festival," Robert Dutton said. "Public things. About you." "He did," Abigail said. "I want you to know I heard about it only recently. I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "I didn't raise him to speak to a woman that way. I don't know entirely where it came from. I know that's not a sufficient answer." "It's an honest one," Abigail said. "That's more than I expected." Robert Dutton looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. "Randall came to me this week and said he wants to apologize himself. I told him he should. I'm telling you first, so it's not a surprise." "Thank you," she said. Randall appeared 2 days later. He was not the version of himself that had stood at her festival booth with a glass of early morning whiskey and an audience. He was stripped of those accessories, a young man who had apparently been having a significant internal experience over the preceding weeks, and who showed up at the general store door looking like someone who had arrived at a conclusion he hadn't wanted to arrive at. "Miss Moore," he said. "Randall," she said. "I was—" He exhaled. "What I said at the festival was wrong. Not just rude. Wrong. The kind of wrong that I didn't fully understand until recently." He looked at her directly, which cost him something visibly. "I understand it now." Abigail studied him. "What changed?" she said. "My father made me read the court transcripts," Randall said. "All of them." A pause. "He made me read the part where you told the Helena attorney what precede means in the context of fraud documentation." Another pause. "Twice." A silence. "I'm sorry," Randall said. "For everything I said. For the fence comment, too." "Your south fence is still down," Abigail said. 3 sections. Randall blinked. "I know," he said. "I fixed it." "Good," she said. He left. She watched him go with the particular feeling of a woman who has been waiting for something without knowing she was waiting, and who has just received it, and who finds it as she finds most received things more complex and more moving than anticipated. The wedding date was set for the 3rd Saturday of October. Not because October was a romantic month in Montana. It was cold, and the light went early, and the mountains had begun their serious business of winter preparation. But Ruth Moore's doctor had said clearly that the high-altitude autumn was hardest on her lungs, and Abigail wanted her mother at the wedding well enough to be present for all of it, not managing symptoms through ceremony. October 3rd Saturday was the window. Jacob said the date was perfect. He would have said any date was perfect, and they both knew it, but it happened to also be true. The planning was straightforward, because Abigail approached it the way she approached everything, with a clear list, a realistic budget, and complete immunity to the pressure of outside opinions about what the wedding of the wealthiest rancher in the territory should look like. Several women in Silver Creek offered opinions anyway. Margaret Pruitt, who had appointed herself unofficial advisor without being asked, told 3 of them to mind their own business, in terms direct enough that the offering of opinions slowed considerably. Nora made Abigail's dress. Not the kind of dress that announced itself not silk or imported lace or anything that would have looked like Abigail trying to be someone she wasn't. Cream wool simple lines fitted correctly for the first time in Abigail's adult life, because Nora was very good at her work and took genuine fierce pleasure in proving it. When Abigail put it on for the fitting, Nora stood back and looked at her with the expression of a craftsperson who has made something true to its material and therefore exactly right. "You look like yourself," Nora said, "only more so." "Is that a compliment?" Abigail said. "It's the best one I know how to give," Nora said. The twist that no one had anticipated arrived 12 days before the wedding when William Marsh returned to Silver Creek. He came back not in flight as he had left, but with an attorney from Denver and a counterfiling that his Denver attorney presented to Foster with the confidence of a man who believed he had found something. He had found something. Not a gap in the fraud case that was airtight. Foster had been right, but a different mechanism entirely. A property tax filing from 1884, 5 years before the fraud had begun, that contained a boundary description, inconsistency, so minor and so technical that it had gone unnoticed through every subsequent legal transaction involving Carter Creek Ranch. A 2-degree variance in the survey notation for the northwest corner of the South grazing land. 2 degrees. In a survey from 1884, William Marsh's Denver attorney was arguing that the inconsistency properly exploited under territorial property law created a cloud on the title to 60 acres of the South grazing land that predated Continental Range Associates' fraud entirely and was therefore not covered by the court's restoration order. 60 acres was not the whole of the South grazing land, but 60 acres was the section that contained Carter Creek's primary water access for the summer herd. Without it, the lease was functionally worthless. Foster came to Carter Creek Ranch at 7 in the evening with the filing in his hand and the expression of a man encountering something unexpected who is working hard to assess it accurately rather than react. "It's a real filing," Foster said. "The 1884 inconsistency is genuine. I've looked at it twice." Jacob looked at Abigail. Abigail had already taken the filing from Foster's hand and was reading it. "How long do we have?" Jacob said to Foster. "They've filed for a preliminary ruling. If the judge grants it." "He won't," Abigail said without looking up. Both men looked at her. She turned to page 3 of the filing and pointed to a specific paragraph. "They're citing the 1884 survey inconsistency as an independent title defect. But look at the remediation statute they're using." She looked at Foster. 1882. Foster frowned. "The survey is from 1884. "Exactly," Abigail said. "They've cited a remediation statute that predates the survey they're challenging. A property defect cannot be remediated under a statute that didn't exist at the time of the defect's creation." She set the filing on the desk. "Their own legal citation invalidates their argument." Silence. "That's—" Foster picked up the filing and looked at the paragraph she'd indicated. He read it once. He read it again. His expression moved through several stages. "That is a significant error." "Their Denver attorney worked fast," Abigail said. "Fast work produces mistakes." Jacob was very still. "You're sure?" "I need 20 minutes with the Territorial Statute Index to confirm the precise dates," she said. "But yes, I'm sure." She had the statute index in the East office. She had 22 minutes of absolute silence while she confirmed every date, every citation, every cross-reference. Foster sat across from her and watched. Jacob stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and looked at nothing. When she looked up, she said, "The 1882 statute cannot be applied to a 1884 survey defect. Full stop." William Marsh's Denver attorney has built his entire counterfiling on a chronologically impossible legal foundation. Foster made a sound that was partly relief and partly professional appreciation. "I'll have a response filed by 9 tomorrow morning." "File it tonight," Abigail said. "Don't give them overnight to find the error and revise." Foster looked at her. Then he picked up his coat and his bag and said, "I'll be at the telegraph office in 20 minutes." He left at a pace that was significantly faster than his usual measured stride. Jacob turned from the window. He looked at Abigail across the desk, at the woman who had, for the second time, looked at a legal mechanism designed to take something from him, and found the exact flaw in its construction that made it collapse. "Abigail," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't look at me like that right now. I need to write up the analysis while the citations are clear in my head." A pause. "All right," he said. He pulled the second chair to the side of the desk, not across from her, but beside her, and sat down. "Then I'll sit here while you write." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she picked up her pen. He sat beside her in the lamplight while she worked, and the ranch settled into its evening around them, and outside the Montana autumn moved through the dark, in the particular way it moved when winter was close, purposeful, certain without apology. She wrote for 2 hours. He stayed for all of it. The preliminary ruling was denied the following afternoon. William Marsh's Denver attorney, confronted with Foster's response brief at 9 in the morning, apparently spent several hours with the statute dates, and arrived at the same conclusion Abigail had arrived at in 22 minutes. He filed a withdrawal of the countermotion at 2 in the afternoon. William Marsh left Silver Creek again, this time with no announced plans to return. Foster sent Abigail a note that said simply, "Second time you've done this. I intend to stop being surprised." She showed it to Jacob that evening. He read it. "He's right," Jacob said. "You should stop doing that to him. It's not kind." "Doing what?" "Finding things in 20 minutes that take everyone else 3 days." He looked at her. "He's a good attorney. It undermines his confidence." She looked at him. "Jacob," she said, "in 7 years of keeping accounts for this valley, I have never once slowed down my work to protect the feelings of someone who was supposed to be doing the same job faster than me." He looked at her. Then he laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, not a polite sound, not a controlled social expression, but the actual laugh of a man genuinely caught off guard by something that delighted him. It changed his whole face. It was, Abigail decided immediately, the best thing she had ever heard in this office, or possibly in any office. She found herself laughing too. They sat together in the east office of Carter Creek Ranch, 12 days before their wedding, and laughed at nothing and everything, at the absurdity of what the past 3 months had contained at 2 Denver attorneys, and 1 bad statute date, at the sheer accumulated weight of what had been fought and won, and what lay ahead. When it faded, they sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had moved past the phase of silence requiring management. 12 days, Jacob said. 12 days, she said. Is there anything you need? She thought about it honestly. My mother needs her green shawl brought from the store. She says the one at the house isn't warm enough. She looked at him. And I need the South grazing lease renewal document signed and filed before the wedding, so I don't think about it during the ceremony. Jacob looked at her. I love you, he said. It was the first time he had said it directly. No embellishment, no construction around it, just the fact of it stated with the same plain certainty he brought to every true thing. Abigail held very still. She had filed many things in the large internal system she had built over 26 years of careful, precise living. This was the first thing that went into a category that had not previously existed, that had no label yet, and that she understood immediately she would spend the rest of her life organizing everything else around. I know, she said. And then, because she had a strict policy about true things, and because this was the truest thing she had said in a very long time. I love you too. The lamp burned between them. Outside Silver Creek was settling into its evening a town that had spent the better part of 3 months being forced to reckon with the distance between what it had assumed and what was true, and that was doing slowly and imperfectly, and with the usual human ratio of grace to stubbornness, the necessary work of that reckoning. Inside the east office of Carter Creek Ranch, Abigail Moore sat with the man she was going to marry and felt for the first time in her adult life the specific and irreplaceable sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not rescued, not settled for, not charitably chosen, chosen, fully, completely. By a man who had looked at the surface the way every other person in Silver Creek had looked at it, and then had looked past it, and had seen what was there, and had decided that what was there was everything. The South Grazing lease renewal was signed and filed 10 days before the wedding. Abigail set the stamped copy in the completed documents folder, wrote the date in the margin, the way she wrote dates in every margin of every document she ever handled, precisely, permanently, without flourish, and then sat for a moment in the east office of Carter Creek Ranch, with her hands flat on the desk, and allowed herself briefly to feel the full weight of what that single document represented. 18 months ago, this lease had been within 60 days of being stolen. The mechanism had been patient, invisible, and very nearly complete. Gerald Stokes had known the ranch's rhythms so well that he had built the fraud around them the way a carpenter builds a hidden wall, using the existing structure to conceal what was being constructed inside it. Another season, Foster had told her, maybe two, and there would have been nothing left to recover. The lien would have filed, the legal challenge would have taken years, and Carter Creek Ranch, 1,800 acres, that Jacob's grandfather had broken with his hands and his father had grown, and Jacob himself had held through 7 years of grief and weather, and the daily grinding work of keeping something alive, would have been gone. Instead, the lease was renewed. The South Grazing land was intact. The water access was secure. She closed the folder. She picked up her coat. She went home to help her mother with the green shawl and the wedding. Ruth Moore had decided that being ill was not a legitimate reason to be unprepared, and she approached the 10 days before her daughter's wedding with the focused energy of a woman drawing on reserves she had been carefully saving for exactly this purpose. She had opinions about the ceremony order. She had opinions about the flowers, which Abigail had not planned to have in any formal arrangement, because flowers in October in Montana were a practical challenge, and Abigail's relationship with impractical challenges was cool at best. Ruth overrode this position with the gentle implacability she had always used when she had decided something mattered, and Jacob, who had met Ruth Moore exactly 3 times, and had already understood precisely where Abigail's particular combination of precision and stubbornness originated, quietly arranged for a supplier in Helena to send what was needed. When the flowers arrived, simple things, late-season wildflowers and dried lavender that smelled like the end of summer. Ruth held one stem and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have loved this." Abigail, who was standing in the doorway of her mother's room with her arms full of the cream wool dress Nora had delivered that morning, said, "I know." "He would have loved Jacob too," Ruth said, "for the same reason I do." "What reason is that?" Ruth looked at her daughter with the particular directness she had always deployed when she wanted Abigail to stop processing and simply receive something. "Because he sees you," she said. "Not who you might be if you tried harder, or looked different, or softened your edges. You, as you already are." She set the flower down. "That's rare, Abigail. Don't take it lightly." "I don't," Abigail said. "I know you don't," Ruth said. "I just wanted to say it. A mother gets to say it." Abigail crossed the room and sat on the edge of her mother's bed and took her hand. Ruth's hand was thin now, lighter than it used to be, but her grip was firm and her eyes were clear, and she was entirely present in the way that mattered most. "Are you all right?" Abigail asked. "Honestly." "I'm better than I've been in 2 years," Ruth said. "Because you're better than you've been in 2 years. She squeezed her daughter's hand once. "Now go hang that dress up properly before it creases." Chatter. The morning of the wedding arrived cold and clear, the particular Montana clarity that came only in October, when the air had been scrubbed clean by the first serious mountain winds, and the sky had a depth to it that felt like looking through something rather than just at it. Nora arrived at the store at 6 in the morning, with her hair already done and her kit in hand, and the expression of a woman who had been preparing for this specific task in her imagination for considerably longer than she would ever admit. "Sit down," she said. "Nora, sit down." Abigail sat. Nora worked in focused silence for 40 minutes, and when she stepped back and looked at what she'd done, her expression cycled through satisfaction, pride, and something that looked briefly like the effort of not crying in that order. "Look," she said, and turned Abigail toward the small mirror above the washstand. Abigail looked. She had never spent much time looking at herself. Not from self-punishment, not from the internalized cruelty of the town's opinions. She had, by her mid-20s, built a relationship with her appearance that was functional and unbothered, the attitude of a woman who had decided her face was the least interesting thing about her and had moved on. But what she saw in the mirror that October morning was something she hadn't anticipated. She looked like herself. Only as Nora had said at the fitting, more so. The dress was exactly right. Her hair was arranged simply because anything elaborate would have been costume. Her face was her face, broad and plain by the town's traditional measure, and in this moment, in this light, with this knowledge behind her eyes, entirely hers, entirely sufficient, entirely the face of a woman who knew exactly who she was. "Well," she said. "Don't you dare say it's fine," Nora said. "I wasn't going to," Abigail said. She looked at Nora in the mirror. "Thank you, for the dress, for all of it." Nora's composure, which had been working hard, made a final heroic effort and succeeded. "You're welcome," she said briskly. "Now we need to get your mother into the wagon before she insists on walking." The church was full. Not because it was a grand social event. The Thornton wedding was not the elaborately staged occasion that Silver Creek had been speculating about since the engagement. It was simple, and its simplicity was not a lack, but a choice, and the distinction was visible in every element. The wildflowers from Helena, the plain ceremony, the ranch workers, and close family and friends who filled the pews alongside the ranching families from the valley. But full nonetheless. Margaret Pruitt was in the third row with her daughter. August Cole was in the fourth, his wife beside him, his color better than it had been at the courthouse. His 50 recovered acres had apparently agreed with him physically. Nora sat in the front on Abigail's side with Ruth Moore, who had made the journey from the wagon to the pew, with her chin level and her breathing managed, and her green shawl settled around her shoulders. Foster had come from Helena. He sat near the back with the slightly uncertain posture of a man attending an event that was outside his primary professional territory. But his expression, when Abigail walked down the aisle, was the same expression he'd had when she corrected the Denver attorney's statute. Dates the frank, uncomplicated admiration of someone watching a person be excellent. She walked alone. It had been her choice. Jacob had offered alternatives. He would walk with her. Margaret Pruitt had offered her son. Reverend Aldridge had suggested a ceremonial form that didn't require a solo entrance. Abigail had said, "I've been walking into rooms alone my whole life. I know how to do it." What she hadn't anticipated was how it would feel to walk into this particular room alone, toward this particular man, with every person in Silver Creek who had ever passed judgment on what she was or wasn't watching her do it. She felt every set of eyes. She kept walking. Jacob was standing at the front of the church in his best suit, which was dark and well-fitted and entirely without performance. And when she came through the door, he looked at her, the way he had been looking at her since the morning she'd kept him waiting 40 minutes in her store while she read his ledgers, with the complete, unwavering attention of a man who had decided this was where his eyes belonged. She walked the full length of the church. She stopped beside him. He said quietly enough that only she could hear, "You look like yourself." "I know," she said. Nora said the same thing. Nora was right. She usually is. Don't tell her that. The corner of his mouth moved. She moved hers in answer. Reverend Aldridge began. The ceremony was 22 minutes long. It was not shortened out of disinterest, but because Abigail had reviewed the standard ceremony format with Reverend Aldridge in advance and identified 3 sections that were ceremonial rather than substantive, and had asked politely and directly whether they could be omitted. Reverend Aldridge had agreed with only mild surprise, because by that point in his acquaintance with Abigail Moore, he had learned to expect the direct approach and had developed a certain appreciation for it. The vows were the standard vows. Abigail had considered writing her own and had decided against it, not because she lacked things to say, but because she distrusted the impulse to perform feeling when the feeling was already there, plain and solid, and requiring no ornamentation. When Reverend Aldridge asked if she took Jacob Thornton as her husband, she said yes, with the same quiet certainty she brought to every true thing. Jacob said his yes the same way. When it was done, when the ring was placed and the blessing given, Jacob looked at her for a moment before he kissed her, with the deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered. And the church was very quiet, and then was not quiet at all. August Cole started it. He put his enormous weathered hands together, and the sound of them was like two pieces of hardwood striking, and it started the cascade. Margaret Pruitt's sharp, efficient applause. Nora's, which was enthusiastic and slightly unsteady. Foster's at the back, which was measured but genuine. The ranch workers in the side pews, who had watched Abigail move through Carter Creek for 3 months, and had their own understanding of what she had done and what she was worth. Ruth Moore did not clap. Her hands were in her lap holding each other. Her eyes were bright. That was enough. The reception was at Carter Creek Ranch in the main house, which Martha Crane had prepared with the intensity of a woman who considered cooking for significant occasions a personal statement of values. There was more food than anyone could eat, which was intentional. Jacob had told Martha, "Make enough that no one leaves hungry, and there's still enough left over that the ranch hands can eat for 2 days." Martha had taken this as a challenge and exceeded it considerably. People ate and talked and moved through the house with the easy permission of guests who have been genuinely welcomed, and the afternoon light came through the windows and moved across the floors. And somewhere in it all, Abigail stood with a plate she kept forgetting to eat from and moved through conversations that would have exhausted her in any previous version of this life, but that today felt simply like the texture of something good. August Cole found her near the kitchen doorway and shook her hand with both of his, the same gesture he'd made on the courthouse steps, and said, "My granddaughter asked me last week what she should study when she's old enough. I told her bookkeeping." He looked at Abigail. "She wanted to know why bookkeeping. I told her to ask you." Abigail looked at him. "What's her name?" "Clara," he said. And then, aware of what that name meant in Carter Creek's history, named before all of this, coincidence. "Tell Clara," Abigail said, "that bookkeeping is just seeing clearly. You learn to look at what's actually there instead of what people tell you is there. And once you know how to do that with numbers, you can do it with everything." August Cole looked at her for a long moment. "I'll tell her exactly that," he said. The twist came 3 hours into the reception. Not a legal mechanism this time, not a counterfiling or a fraudulent document. Something smaller, and in its own way, more significant. Helena Marsh came to Carter Creek Ranch. She had not been invited. She appeared at the door in the late afternoon while the reception was still full and present alone. No mother, no social companions, no protective arrangement of other people to diffuse the directness of her being there. She knocked at the front door like a person who understood she had no automatic right to enter and who wanted that understood. Martha Crane answered, looked at her, and came to find Abigail with an expression that said, "Your call entirely." Abigail went to the door. Helena stood on the front step in a plain gray dress that Abigail had never seen her wear before. She was not performing anything. Her expression was exactly what it had been on the courthouse steps the morning of the first hearing, unsettled, working through something she hadn't finished working through but present with it rather than hiding it. "I don't expect to come in," Helena said immediately. "I know I wasn't. I'm not here to make today about anything other than what it is." She paused. "I wanted to give you something." She held out a small envelope. Abigail took it. "My uncle's fraud affected people I care about in this valley," Helena said, "including families that my family has known for 30 years. My father—" She stopped, started again. "My father had reasons for what he did that I understand, and that I also find that I cannot defend." Her voice was even, but it cost her something. "I'm not here to defend him. I'm here because I've spent 3 months thinking about what it means to be a woman in this valley who is measured by what she looks like and who she marries, and what it means to have contributed to that measure being applied to you." She met Abigail's eyes. "I'm sorry, genuinely, for my part in it." Abigail looked at her. "What's in the envelope?" she said. "A letter of introduction," Helena said. "To a woman in Helena, Eleanor Vance. She runs a school for women, practical education, bookkeeping, business management, law basics. She's been trying to expand the program for 2 years, and she needs someone with connections in the ranching community to vouch for its value." Helena looked at her steadily. "I thought of you." Abigail opened the envelope. She read the single page inside. She read it again. "Why?" she said. "Because you're the most qualified person I've ever met," Helena said. "And because I have spent my whole life being trained to be decorative, and I am 24 years old, and I am tired of it. And I think there are women in this territory who are also tired of it, and who deserve better options." She paused. "And because you showed this town that the woman everyone dismissed was the most capable person in it. That should mean something. I want it to mean something." Abigail held the letter. She thought about the 7 families whose land was recovered. About August Cole's granddaughter Clara, who wanted to know why bookkeeping. About her own father reading every document twice in 3 weeks to save a store. About the years of invisible work, the years of being the piece of furniture that was useful, but that nobody looked at. "Tell Eleanor Vance," Abigail said, "that I'll write to her next week." Helena exhaled. "Thank you." "Helena." Abigail held her gaze. "Come in. Have something to eat." Helena blinked. I didn't expect." "I know," Abigail said. "Come in anyway." Helena came in. Jacob found Abigail an hour later, standing near the window of the front room with the Eleanor Vance letter in her hand, and the expression she wore when she was building something in her mind. The forward-looking organizing focus that he had learned to recognize as the specific look of his wife, figuring out what came next. He stood beside her. "Helena Marsh is in our kitchen helping Martha cut pie," he said. "I know," she said. "That's unexpected." "Yes." She handed him the letter. He read it. He read it again. "You're going to do this," he said. It was not a question. "I'm going to do this," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know what this means. Eleanor Vance's school has been trying to get established ranching families to support it for 2 years. The moment your name is attached." "It changes the conversation," Abigail said. "Yes, that's why I'm doing it." Jacob looked at her profile. At the certainty in it, the complete unbothered clarity of a woman who had decided something and was already 3 steps into the execution. He had spent 7 years after Clara's death learning to live with the specific ache of an empty space that he had not known how to fill or stop feeling. He had filled his life with work and with the management of that ache, and he had not genuinely stopped expecting that the space would close. It had closed. Not because someone had come and smoothed it over, but because someone had sat across a desk from him and looked at numbers with complete honesty, and shown him without intending to show him anything personal. What it looked like when the person gave everything they had to work that mattered. "Abigail," he said. She looked up from the letter. "What do you want?" he said. "Not the school, not the audit, not the next case or the next document. What do you want? For yourself?" She looked at him. The question was not one she had been asked often. She had always defined herself through the work, through the function, through what she could do, and what she could protect, and what she could fix. Being asked what she wanted for herself, not what she was good at, not what was needed, but what she wanted, required a different kind of reaching. She thought about it honestly. "This," she said finally. "What's in this room right now? Work that matters, and a person who sees me doing it." She held his gaze. "That's not a small thing to want." "No," he said. "It isn't. Most people in this town would say I should want something more, something grander, something that looked more like a conventional happy ending. Most people in this town," Jacob said, "spent 3 months telling each other a story that turned out to be completely wrong." He looked at her steadily. "I'll defer to your judgment over theirs." She smiled at him. The full smile, the one that started in her eyes, the one that had been identified on the night of Foster's dinner as the most beautiful thing in the room, and that had not since been revised. The years that followed were not simple. No years on working land in Montana Territory were simple. There were hard winters and difficult cattle seasons, and the ongoing complexity of running a ranch alongside a marriage, alongside a school that grew faster than anyone had projected, because it turned out Eleanor Vance had been right. There were women across the territory who were tired of being told their only valuable quality was decorative, and who came to the program with the hungry focus of people who had been waiting for permission that nobody had the right to withhold in the first place. Abigail managed Carter Creek's finances with the same precision she had brought to the audit, and under her stewardship, the ranch grew not dramatically, not with the kind of expansion that came from risk and spectacle, but with the steady compounding growth of a business that knew exactly what it had and managed it without waste. She wrote to Eleanor Vance the week after the wedding. She traveled to Helena 4 months later and sat in the school's cramped single-room office and talked with Eleanor for 3 hours about what the curriculum needed and what the students were asking for, and what the gaps were between what was being taught and what women in the ranching territory actually needed to know. She came back and told Jacob what she intended to do about those gaps. He said, "Tell me what you need." She told him. He provided it. The first scholarship in Abigail's name went to a 16-year-old girl from a homesteading family in the Eastern Valley, whose father had told her that schooling for girls was money spent on something that would belong to someone else's family. The girl's name was Petra, and she arrived at Eleanor Vance's school with 2 dresses and a head for figures that Abigail recognized immediately, with the particular recognition of someone seeing a young version of a familiar thing. She wrote Petra a letter after the first term. She wrote, "The work is the answer to everything they told you couldn't do. Do the work. The rest follows." Petra kept the letter for the rest of her life. The question came on their first anniversary. They were at Carter Creek the evening of October's 3rd Saturday, and Jacob had given her a single wildflower, a late-season thing improbable in October, found somehow and given without ceremony, the way he gave everything. Martha's daughter, a girl of 8 named Rose, who had been allowed to stay up late for the occasion, looked at the flower in Abigail's hand with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be diplomatic about questions. "Mr. Thornton," Rose said, "why didn't you marry the prettiest lady in town?" The room went very still in the particular way rooms go still when a child has said the thing that every adult has been carefully navigating around. Jacob looked at Rose with complete seriousness, the way he looked at everyone who asked him a genuine question. "I did," he said. Rose frowned. She looked at Abigail. She looked back at Jacob. The logic was not immediately assembling itself for her in the expected way. "But everyone says," she began. "Everyone says a lot of things," Jacob said. "Most of what everyone says is about surfaces, what things look like from the outside quickly, without looking long enough to see what's actually there." He looked at Abigail beside him. "Pretty is something you see in the first 10 seconds. What I married takes longer to see. But once you see it," he paused, "it's the only thing that's real." Rose considered this with the deep processing silence of a child, taking in something she would not fully understand for years. But that was settling into her memory intact, to be retrieved later when she had the context to understand it. "Like how the creek looks small from the road," she said finally, "but it's really deep when you get close." Jacob looked at her. "Exactly like that," he said. Rose nodded satisfied and went to find Martha. Abigail held the wildflower. She looked at Jacob. She thought about the summer harvest festival, and the wooden crate, and the laughing, and the specific quality of Randall Dutton's cruelty, which had felt at the time like just another morning in a long series of mornings that required management. She thought about the ledgers on her counter, and 40 minutes of silence, and 19 discrepancies, and a man who had leaned against her wall and waited. She thought about the county records office, and the void document statute, and Howard Beale's expression. She thought about the night she'd found the deed with Stokes's name on it, and the morning after when Jacob had come back from the barn with wet boots and found her still at the desk. She thought about all of it, and understood with the same precise certainty she brought to every calculation that mattered that none of it had been accidental. Not her father's lessons with the double-entry ledger, not the years of invisible work that had built the skill, not the booth at the far eastern edge of the festival, where Jacob Thornton had walked with the deliberate patience of a man looking for something true. All of it had been preparation, and all of it had been worth it. She set the wildflower on the table between them. She took Jacob's hand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For looking past the first 10 seconds. He turned his hand in hers and held it properly. "Thank you," he said, "for being worth the looking." Outside, the Montana sky had gone the deep blue-black of a clear October night, and the stars were out in the particular abundance that required complete darkness to see the kind of sky that only revealed itself when you were far enough from everything bright and false and performed to let the real light through. Inside Carter Creek Ranch, Abigail Thornton sat with her husband and her wildflower, and the knowledge of everything she had built and protected and earned and loved, and the future spread out in front of her. Like land she already knew how to read, not without difficulty, not without weather and work and seasons that would ask everything of her but hers, completely and irrevocably hers. Some people are seen immediately. Some people require patience and honesty and the willingness to look past what is easy and obvious and conventionally pleasing, to look long enough and clearly enough to find what is actually there. Abigail Moore had spent 26 years waiting for someone with that kind of vision. Jacob Thornton had spent 7 years learning that the rarest thing in the world was not beauty. It was truth. And when truth finally stood in front of him, plain and steady and entirely completely itself, he had the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to choose it and the good sense to never for a single day of the rest of his life